Welcome students. Now we are going for unit 7 of block 2, that is going to detail about types and levels of conflict. So in this particular unit, what you are going to understand? You are going to understand with the conceptual problems of identifying the meaning and definition of conflict. What are the functions and objective of the conflict, and what are the various kinds of types and levels which manifest the conflict. So this particular unit is basically detailing around on these three fundamentals. In that case, you are going to understand the conceptual problems in identifying the meaning and detailing about the definition of the concept, then functions and objectives of the conflict, and finally various kinds, types, levels and its manifestations of the conflict. So let us first start with the definition of the conflict. What is conflict? Conflict is creation, a certain amount of discord, inner divergence, outer controversies which are being originated, and its very elements that ultimately hold up to the group together. See, another definition by Kenneth is conflict as a form of competition. He is considering conflict as a form of competition in which the competing parties recognize that they have mutually incompatible goals. So Kenneth says that conflict is nothing but a kind of competition where competing parties, they recognize that they have mutually incompatible goals. Another definition by Lewis is that what is conflict? Conflict is a struggle over values and claims for scarcity of power and resources, in which the aim is of the opponent is to neutralize, injure or eliminate the rivals. So conflict is always a conscious. Indeed, it evokes the deepest emotions and strongest passions and enlists the greatest concentration of attention and effort. Both competition and conflict, they are form of struggle. So in this definition, both competition and conflict have been considered as the forms of struggle. So competition, however, is a continuous and impersonal. Conflict is intermittent and personal. Another definition by Robert says that conflict emerges whenever two or more persons or groups seeks to process the same object, occupy the same space or the same exclusive position, which play incompatible goals or undertake mutually incompatible means for achieving the purposes. So these thinkers have given varied nature and definition of conflict, which we have just deliberated before you. Now, after having understood about the basic meaning of conflict, we look forward to other dimensions of the conflict. So what is that? That is functions and objective of the conflict. Let us first look at the conflict from constructive point of view, means constructive aspect. In this, Marx has said that conflict leads not only to ever-changing relations within the existing social structure, but the total social system undergoes a transformation through a conflict. So the basic tenets of the Marx definition is that under conflict, the total social system undergoes transformation. Another constructive consequences of conflict relation, it has been given by under the definition of Dublin. They say that intergroup conflict is a fundamental institutionalized social process. Dublin is considering conflict as a social process which is institutionalized, which determines direction of social change and effect defines social welfare. So if you see this definition in proper concentration, so it says that conflict is nothing but a kind of social process which is institutionalized and it determines the direction of social change and in thus affects social welfare. Mack and Center definition says that conflict sets group boundaries by strengthening group cohesiveness and separateness. Conflict reduces tension and permits maintenance of social interaction under stress. Conflict clarifies objectives. Conflict results in establishment of group norms, and without conflict, accommodative relations would result into subordination rather than agreement. So this definition basically gives 5 different dimensions of the conflict, and it is related with the group behavior. It says that conflict sets into group boundaries by strengthening the group cohesiveness. It also reduces tension and permits maintenance of social interaction because one is under stress. It clarifies objectives. It results into establishment of group norms, and without conflict, accommodative relations would result into subordination rather than agreement. After this understanding about the various dimensions of the conflict, now let us look at the type and level of conflict. So the typology of conflict has been given as: typology facilitates analysis of conflict, which could facilitate resolving as well as understanding and analyzing conflict. Another classification of rights, it says that there are 4 different types of conflicts: physical conflict, political conflict, ideological conflict, and legal conflict. So rights classification says that basically conflict can have 4 different types. What is physical conflict? When 2 or more entities try to occupy and fight for the same space at the same time. So in physical conflict, 2 or more entities, they are trying to occupy same space at the same time. In political conflict, it is moving from 2 or more entities to a kind of group, when a group tries to impose its policies over others. Ideological conflict, in which systems of thought or values, they struggle with each other. And finally, in legal conflict, in which controversies over claims are adjusted by mutually recognized procedure. So we have seen that we have 4 different type of conflict under rights classification. The first is physical conflict, then it is a political conflict, then ideological conflict, and finally legal conflict. Along with these 4 conflicts, another conflict has been recognized as war. The ultimate war in the legal sense has been termed as union of all 4 type of conflict as noted above. Means when we are going to combine physical, political, ideological and legal struggle, so all these 4 together make a conflict as war. So in a physical struggle, what happens? Armies try to occupy the same space by either annihilation or by disarming or by capturing the territory of the other countries. Under political struggle of nations to achieve policies against resistance of other parties. In ideological struggle, people to preserve or extend ways of life or value system over others. And in legal struggle, any state or group of states to acquire titles to vindicate the claims of other parties or state, and to prevent violence or to punish offense by recognized procedures of regulated violence. So we have seen that the 5th typology of the conflict is a war, which is a kind of combination of 4 type of struggle. The one is physical struggle, then political struggle, then ideological struggle, and finally legal struggle. Now comes another classification of conflict. In this conflict, it is Anatole classification. In Anatole classification, the conflict has been given 3-4 dimensions. One is fight, another is game, and the third is debate. And these 3 classifications have been given distinction on the basis of 3 criteria. What are those 3 criteria? The first is how opponent is being viewed or perceived. The second is what is the intent of the opposing party, and the third is rational content of the situation. So all these 3 criteria, the fights, games and debates, these three type of conflicts have been given a kind of classification. So let us study one by one. So how we are seeing the opponent. So this classification of fight says that in the fight, the opponent is seen as nuisance. In the game, because you are in the game, so your opponent is just like a mirror image of your, means like oneself. And under debate, opponent is seen as essential, but of a different kind of thing, different kind of entity. Now let us see the next criteria. In the criteria of intent of the opposing party. So in the fight, what happens? The intent of the opposing party is to harm. While in the game, you have to outwit him, and in the debate, you have to convince him by your arguments. So it happens in debate. Now see the third. What is the rational content in the situation? What is the rational content of situation in the fight is that it is devoid of rationality. While in the games, it is completely rational, and in the case of debate, it is rational but presumed. So in debate, the situation is presumed as rational. In the game, it is completely rational, and in the first category of fights, almost the concept of rationality does not exist. So in this classification, basis of starting point of the struggle, the image of the opponent held by each party, objective of the each party, and mood of the interaction. This classification is further diversified. Again, criteria has been changed, or rather you can say further expanded. So the criteria is basis or starting point of the struggle, then image of the opponent, perceived image of the opponent by the other party about the other party, then objective of the each party, and finally the mode of interaction. So in fight, what happens is that the starting point of struggle is because of the mutual fear or hostility between the parties, and image of the opponent is considered as nuisance. Objective of the party is harm or destroy or subdue or drive away the opponent from the situation. And what is the mode of interaction? The mode of interaction is completely non-rational. The existence of rational is not possible. In the what happens in the situation number 2, that is game, the another aspect of conflict is that to strive for mutually incompatible goals within the constraint of certain rules. This is the starting point of the struggle, and how the other party is being viewed as mirror image of the one competing party, and your objective of the party is to outwit the opponent. And finally, when we look at the mode of interaction, it is cooperate to provide maximum challenge, means you are cooperating but going for the maximum challenge to the opposition. Like games, in the third classification of the conflict is under debate. So struggle, the starting point of the struggle is disagreement between the parties. What is the fact, what should be, all these are the starting point of the struggle. And what happens about the image is generally mistaken or misguised in the category of debate. And the objective of the each party is to convince the opponent about their respective argument, and mode of interaction is verbal interaction of argument. So these two different type of classification given by based on the criteria of starting point of the struggle, then image of the opponent which is being perceived or held by the party, objective of the each party, and mode of the interaction. And based on these criteria, 3 different level of the dynamic conflict dynamics is given: fight, games, and debates. Now see another classification of conflict. In this classification of conflict, it has been basically given as 4 different categories. The first is standard state versus war, that is China and India in armed intervention involving significant loss of life, or what happens United States intervention in Vietnam, or Soviet the erstwhile USSR intervention in Afghanistan. The second is decolonizing wars of national liberation. This is another category of the conflict. And third level of conflict is internal wars based on ideological goals, which is happening inside the territorial boundary of a respective country. And the fourth is state-nation wars, including armed resistance by on the basis of ethnic ethnicity, then language, or by religious minority, often in the purpose of either separation from the state, just like we have seen in Tamil militant organization in Sri Lanka. This was the example of state-nation wars. So in this classification of conflict, we have four different level of conflict. The one is standard state versus wars, and the second is decolonizing wars of national liberation. Third is internal wars, which is based on ideology, or it may be based on any other ideological differences which is happening inside the territorial boundary of a country. And the fourth is state-nation wars, including armed resistance, that we have given the example of LTTE. Now another classification of conflict is basically 18 levels of conflict, one of the most diversified classification of conflict. So in this 18 level classification of conflict is what the first is personal quarrel. It happens in the family, individual relationship, sibling, husband, wife as a family unit. Then family versus family, this conflict is also there. Then the conflict of because of clan or group or tribe, this kind of conflict. Fourth is community quarrels, town versus town, state versus state. Then sectional quarrels, south area versus north area, the example of Southern Ireland and other part of the country. Then workers against managers, union management disagreement, this is another kind of conflict. Then dispute between trade unions. Then political parties, two or more competing political parties of differing ideologies, they are fighting for the space in elections. Then conflict between different races, ethnicities or tribes. Then religious conflict based on religious belief. Then racial and religious cultural organizations, these kind of conflict is there. Ideological quarrel is there, communism versus capitalism. Then business function versus government, labor versus communism and socialism. So these are ideological quarrels. Then occupational conflict means just like farmer versus industrial worker, blue collar worker versus white collar worker. Then another conflict is within the given industry. Finally, we have competition between industry, like you can have heavy vehicles versus light commercial vehicle, or you can have, let's say, silk versus plastic or synthetic rayon. Then national rivalries, nation versus nation, it could be because of boundary also, it could be because of international conflict also, it because of any economic scarcity of or abundance of resources. Then we have conflict between the cultures, either in the group or outside of the group. Then we have seen the conflict because of Cold War, United States of America and the erstwhile USSR over satellites, democracies, all these things. And finally we had the conflict of East versus West. Now we in this continuation we find another 8 kind of social conflict which was given by Kenneth. So what are these 8 kinds of social conflicts? This definition of conflict is basically based on social dimension. So the first level of this conflict is conflict between or among different persons. Then boundary conflict between groups means segregated groups depending upon their ideology, belief, all these kind of regions. Then ecological conflict between the groups. One group can claim that because of your practices, because of your behavior, there is a disruption of ecological activities. Then we have homogeneous organization conflict between organizations of same character or purpose, such as state versus state, one sectarian versus another sectarian. Then we have heterogeneous organization, means there is no homogeneous activities in that. So we can have between unlike organization like state versus church, or union versus cooperation, or university versus church or state. Then we have conflict of a person and a group, mainly socialization of conflict, a child versus family, person versus peer group, person with other superiors or inferior. Then another level of conflict is between person and organization, when there is a difference between we can give a kind of example between when there is a conflict of interest between union of workers and employees versus management of an organization. So in continuation of the classification of conflict, we see another classification of Johann Galtung classification, which is 4 by 4. It is very easily understood as 4 by 4 classification. What is that? We have level. The level of classification is on individual level and as collective level, and then intra-system conflict and inter-system conflict. What is inter-system conflict? Conflict that can be found in the smallest subunit of the system, be within the inside of the system. And inter-system conflict is which split the system in parts, each of the system standing for its own goal. So there is a conflict between two subsystems of a whole system. So based on inter-system conflict and inter-system conflict, we have 4 different classification of the conflict. So when the conflict is at individual level and it is intra-system, means within the system, then it is known as intrapersonal conflict. When the conflict is inter-system, means within the system but in between two subsystems and at individual level, so it is known as interpersonal conflict. Now look at the another level, that is collective level. We are moving from individual level to collective level. So under collective level, when the conflict is intra-system, then it is known as intranational conflict. And finally, international conflict. Always remember, international conflict is at collective level, and at inter-system conflict level means when the system is split into different parts and each subsystem is standing for its own goal. Okay, so this Galtung classification, 4 by 4 classification, says 4 level of classification of conflict: intrapersonal, interpersonal, intranational and international. 4I, just to remember it very easily, it is 4I classification: intrapersonal, interpersonal, intranational and international, individual and collective level, intra-system and inter-system level. Then another classification of conflict has given by Dennis. According to him, this classification is famously known as 3-pillar framework. What is 3 pillar? The pillar number 1 is any particular conflict including its distinguishing characteristics, and pillar number 2 says cause and condition of the conflict, and pillar number 3 says that conflict intervention and its implementation. So these 3-pillar framework is based on, first is conflict includes its own spatial characteristics which can be distinguished from each other, and pillar number 2 is cause and condition of the conflict, and third is conflict intervention and its implementation. Origination of conflict, its condition and its causes and reason of the conflict, and finally how conflict is intervened and it is implemented. Conflict is also a process based classification. So what it says that it has 5 level of stages. What are those stages? Conflict first initiates. First it is a kind of cycle wise. First initiates, then escalates, then controlled maintenance, then further de-escalate, and finally it is terminate. Terminate means settlement and resolution of the conflict, means conflict resolution. So conflict is a process. This process has 5 stages. First it initiates, then it escalates to the another level, and finally controlled maintenance activities to overcome it for further escalation, then finally de-escalation, and at the last it is termination of the conflict, which can be understood as settlement or conflict resolution. 3 kinds of conflict has been given by another thought and thinker. The first is latent conflict. It is known as pre-manifest conflict process, MCP. Latent conflict is known as pre-MCP. What is this latent conflict? It says that those conflicts which are developing but not yet expressed themselves in a manner which is very observant to parties by themselves. So latent conflict is available, it is existing, but it is not yet expressed in such a manner that it has become quite observable. So it is known as latent conflict, and it is also considered as pre-manifestation of conflict process. So in the latent conflict is basically not manifested. So now second level is manifest conflict process, MCP. So under these conflicts that have developed to the extent that they are observable but not has been expressed so far in a violent manner. So in the second MCP, what is happening? It is accepting that conflict has developed up to certain extent, but it has not taken the shape of a violent manner, but it can be easily observed. The third is AMCP, aggressive manifest conflict process. So AMCP are those conflicts that have escalated to such a level from MCP that level of expression is very high. They are not merely capable of being noticed and experienced, but also destructive to the parties, resources and others as well. Let us have another clarity of that. In latent conflict, conflict is there but it is not observable, or it has not been expressed in such a manner that it can be observed. So it is known as pre-manifest conflict process. Means under latent conflict, conflict has not been manifested. Under manifest conflict process, your conflict is observable but it has not taken the shape of a violent behavior or manner. And the third and last one is aggressive manifest conflict process, AMCP. In this category, conflict has moved from the stage of MCP by the level of expression, and it has all the potential to become destructive to the parties, resources and others as well. Finally, so students, before we finish this unit, for your understanding what we have covered here different definitions of the conflict by various thoughts and thinkers, maybe Kenneth, then Simmel, then Lewis, then Park, and after that we have gone for objective and functions of the unit. So there was given 5 level classification of understanding about the conflict. Finally we came for types and level of the conflict. In that we have seen the rights classification of conflict, which has given 4 level of conflict like physical conflict, political conflict, ideological conflict, legal conflict. Then another level of conflict they have given a characteristics of war. So what happens in the war? All those 4 conflict as a struggle: physical struggle, political struggle, ideological struggle and finally legal struggle. Then we have seen Anatole's classification, which has given 3 kind of conflict as classification of conflict as fight, game and debate, depending upon the 3 criteria of how opponent is viewed, what is the intent of the party and the rational content of the situation. This classification was further diversified, fight and games and debates, on the 4 criteria. There was basis on starting point of the struggle, and then it was image of the opponent held by the other party, objective of the each party and mode of interaction. Then we got for another 4 categories of classification of the conflict, which was standard state versus war, then decolonization of war for the national liberation, intent war based on ideological ideas and goals, and finally state nation wars including arms resistance. After this we got class 18 level classification, famous 18 level classification of conflict given by Stewart. This 18 level classification followed by Kenneth Boulding classification of 8 kind of social conflict. In this classification, group behavior and social interaction has been given a prominence. This is followed by John Galton classification. This classification is 4x4 classification, means 4I classification: intrapersonal, interpersonal, intranational and international. 4I classification, and the criteria was individual level and collective level, and based on intra-system conflict and inter-system conflict. After that, then is 3-pillar framework, in which pillar 1 was about distinguishing characteristics of the conflict, then cause and the condition of the conflict, and finally conflict intervention and implementation. After that, conflict was considered as a process, and this process has 5 levels. The first is initiation, then escalation, controlled maintenance, de-escalation and finally termination of the conflict, which is known as conflict settlement or conflict resolution. Then finally we have seen conflict 3 level depending upon the manifest level of conflict process. So latent conflict is pre-MCP, means pre-manifest conflict process. Then MCP, manifest conflict process, in which conflict is observable, and in aggressive manifest conflict process where observed violence behavior is implemented or manifested. With this, our unit number 7 is over, and we will meet again with all of you for unit number 8, which will be about different theories of conflict. Till then, bye, we meet again. Thank you for your attention.